Welcome to the Just Ingredients podcast. I'm Cara Lynn, and here we talk all things nourishing to the mind, body, and soul. This is a place where you can find just good ingredients to life. Dr. Sarah Hill is an award-winning research psychologist and professor with expertise in women, health, and sexual psychology. At the intersection of evolutionary biology, social psychology, and neuroscience, Dr. Hill's research is aimed at understanding the role that hormones, the immune system, and the environment play in relationship and health behaviors, especially in women. Dr. Hill's research laboratories are located in the Department of Psychology at TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, like you heard in our bio, is Dr. Sarah Hill, and I am really excited to talk to her today, and I know you listeners are going to love this topic today because I always get so many questions about birth control and how it affects our health and things like that, so I'm excited to talk to you today. So thank you for being here.
Yes.
And as we begin, will you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, maybe why you got interested in studying about the pill, things like that?
I'm a researcher. I'm a psychologist and a university professor, and I got my background is in evolutionary psychology. So I actually was really interested in evolutionary biology when I was in college, and then I learned that you can use these same principles, just like understanding like the biological function of different types of traits, and you can apply that to the human mind and to try to better understand behavior and like why we do the things that we do. And I was always interested in women because, you know, a lot of research, especially in, when you have like researchers studying the biological basis of behavior in, humans, a lot of those researchers tend to be men. And a lot of the perspective in terms of understanding things like partner preferences and, motivational states and everything, it kind of had a male slant to it. And so I was really interested in trying to understand these things in women. And so much of my early career was spent understanding women and like partner attractions, like who are women attracted to, why they're attracted to them, risky sexual behavior in women. So really interested in, why women take sexual risks when they know that, they're not good for them and so on and so forth. And what ultimately led me to study the birth control pill was going off of it. And I had the experience that so many women that I've talked to at this point have had, and that is that I went off of the pill and all of a sudden I felt like I woke up. I was like, oh, like it was about 3 months after I was off of it. I was like, oh my gosh, like I recognize this person that I am. And it's different than what it has been for the last 10 years, that I was on the pill. I noticed that I had more energy. I was feeling things more deeply. So it was like things that were joyful felt more joyful. I mean, things that were hard felt more hard, but it felt good. It just felt I felt really alive, vibrant in a way that I hadn't. I was downloading new music for the first time in, 10 years. I started downloading playlists. I started listening to music when I cooked. I was enjoying cooking more. I was enjoying going to the gym more. I was enjoying sex more. I mean, I just felt more alive. And I was like, I wonder if this has something to do with going off of the birth control pill. And, what's funny about this is that up until this point, because I was on the pill much of my early adult life, like I went on it when I was about 17 or 18, and I was on it for 10, 11, 12 years, pretty much straight, except for having my 2 kids and then lactating. But that's not really a normal hormonal state for anyone. But I didn't spend a whole lot of time, off like as a naturally cycling woman after, the time I was 18. And during that time, I had done research and I've published papers on the effects of women's sex hormones on motivational states and attraction and, some of these other processes. And I never took it and I never connected the dots that, okay, so hormones affect all of these things and you're putting a hormone in your body that's shutting down your own hormone production and you expect it's not going to have any change on your psychological states. Like that's nuts. After I went off of it and I had these experiences of feeling so different and feeling so much more alive and just like more three-dimensional, I started doing research into like what do we know and not know about the effects of hormonal birth control on the brain and then on women and even their sense of themselves. And that research is what led to the writing of the book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. And because there's so much information that was out there. And there's also a lot of information that's not out there yet. But there's really important research questions that need to be asked about the way that the pill changes women.
So interesting. So I'm curious, did you feel like bad on the pill, or you just didn't even notice you felt different until you actually went off the pill?
No, it's really funny because I didn't feel bad on the pill. I had the experience many women do where they're like, I'm great on the pill. It feels just fine. I didn't have major like mental health problems or major problems with libido. But I will say this, and this is so interesting, and I've heard this also from a lot of women, is that I've always had this narrative about myself as being somebody who becomes really easily overwhelmed and can sort of fall into a deep funk pretty easily. And that ends up not being true. That was the pill. But I had
Oh,
no idea.
interesting.
Yeah, I had no idea. I thought that was, who I was. And it didn't feel intolerable. You know what I mean? Like it was like I never had to go on, psychotropic medication. I didn't, it wasn't like I was like depressive. And it wasn't like I was so anxious that I was having panic attacks and, having to rearrange my life. Instead, it was just that I felt like, oh, I'm a really anxious, I'm a pretty anxious person. And like, oh, I can't, it's really easy for me to fall into a deep gray funk. But then after I went off of it, I was like, neither of those things are true, and what's really funny about that, I've been off of it now for almost a decade, probably more than a decade now. And yeah, no more than a decade now. And it took me about 10 years to actually understand that, no, that story I had about myself wasn't true. That's not me. Because for the last, 10, 15 years, that hasn't been true of me. And so it must have been birth control. So I didn't really have a problem with the pill. I just, it was just then when I was off of it, because, you don't really notice. I think that when we experience changes in the pill, I think they're gradual and that you just sort of, and your narrative about yourself changes because we're constantly updating our, sense of self and who we are based on the way that we respond to different environments. And over time, we sort of develop a story about ourselves, and that changes over time based on experiences. And yeah, the story that I'd been telling myself turns out that it wasn't really even true.
Yeah, that is so interesting. So I have a lot of questions to ask you about the birth control pill and, so many things that we're hearing out there on social media. I want to see if they're true or not. But let's just maybe start more at the basics of like, what is the birth control pill and what is it doing to your body?
To understand the way that the birth control pill works, the first thing that we really have to understand is how a natural cycle works, because the birth control pill works by switching that off. And so just for a minute, to orient people who aren't really familiar with the changes in our sex hormones and the way that our cycles work, the first day of your cycle is the day that you get your period. So that marks the beginning of a new cycle. And that's cycle day 1. And at that point, hormones are really, really low. So your sex hormones crash at the end of each cycle. And that's actually what prompts your period. It prompts the endometrial lining to begin to release. And during that time, hormone levels are low. And when hormone levels are low, the brain picks up on that because we have hormone receptors on our brain and on the hypothalamus specifically. And it picks up on the fact that hormones are low, which means that you have not just released an egg and that you probably should start developing a new one. And so a state of low hormones tells the brain you need to stimulate the ovaries and get some some follicles developing so that way we can begin a new process of ovulation. So the brain starts stimulating the ovaries start maturing egg follicles. And as that's going on, that causes the release of estrogen. And so what happens is your follicles are being stimulated. That causes estrogen release. And then one dominant follicle takes over, which is the one that's going to mature fully into the egg that gets released. And once it starts maturing, then estrogen levels really start to climb. And they continue to climb really sharply until right before ovulation, which for most women happens around day 14 of the cycle. So about 2 weeks after the day that your period started is generally when most women ovulate. And so at that point, the egg gets released and estrogen levels fall. And then that empty egg follicle actually turns into a temporary endocrine structure, and it starts to release progesterone, which is women's other primary sex hormone. And so progesterone is then released during the second half of the cycle, which is called the luteal phase of the cycle. And this is the phase of the cycle in which the body is waiting to see whether that egg that was just released is going to, be fertilized and then implant itself. And so progesterone, when it's being released, this is a time in the cycle when, one, you can't get pregnant from sex you have. So if you have sex in the luteal phase, because the train has already left the station with the egg being released, this is an infertile time in the cycle. But it's also a time in the cycle where the brain does not stimulate the ovaries any longer because an egg has already been released. Right. So the release of progesterone, again, that hormone from the second half of the cycle, is actually a signal to the brain not to tell the ovaries to develop any eggs. Because essentially, it's like your body waiting to see whether that egg it already released is going to be fertilized and implant. And so it's sort of a wait and see time with the brain ovarian axis. And the way that the birth control pill works is by mimicking the second half of the cycle, because it has a synthetic progestin, which is a synthetic form of progesterone. And the way that this works is that it stimulates progesterone receptors in the brain, in the hypothalamus. And this tells the brain, hey, an egg has already been released. You don't need to stimulate the ovaries and tell them to start maturing egg follicles, because we need to see whether we're going to get pregnant from this last one that was released. Right. And so taking that same daily dose of hormone, it keeps telling the brain the same information. It's like, oh, we're waiting to see whether or not we're pregnant. Don't do anything. Don't stimulate the ovaries. And that's why we don't ovulate, is because you take the same daily dose of this medication. And then that just keeps telling the brain, you don't need to stimulate the ovaries. And then you get that message over and over and over again. And then when you take the placebo pills and you're not getting that same hormonal message again, you again experience a hormone crash, similar to what you do at the end of a natural cycle, because during the luteal phase, which is that second half of the cycle when progesterone is released, what you get is you get progesterone rising until about the beginning of the second week of the luteal phase, which is the week before your period starts. And that's a point at which either fertilized egg is going to implant itself or it's not. And if it hasn't, then progesterone levels start to fall. And then when hormone levels totally crash at the end of the cycle, that's then what prompts the release of the endometrial lining, your period, and then the start of a new cycle. So anytime that hormone levels are low, the brain starts stimulating the ovaries. And when estrogen is high, they're starting to rise. When that's the dominant hormone, that's also a signal to the brain that it needs to be communicating to the ovaries to keep on stimulating egg follicles. And so essentially the pill works by putting us into this other state. We're never in a state where hormone levels are kept really low for any period of time. And we're never in a state where estrogen is the dominant sex hormone. Instead, we're constantly in the state where our brain is being stimulated by a synthetic form of progesterone to keep it from communicating with the ovaries to start maturing egg follicles.
You did such a great job explaining that. That was nice and easy to understand, a big complex thing. Oh, I have so many questions after that, because now I'm curious. So the brain, it has to adapt to these hormonal changes, correct?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The thing is our brain, it used to be thought that, that neuroplasticity was something that stopped once brain development stopped, but we know better than that now. And the brain is a dynamic process. It's like it's always changing and adapting to the things going on in the environment. And although this is slower once you're an adult than it is when you're younger, we do still get this sort of adaptation. And so, a person would expect that when you've been given the same daily dose of this hormone every day, that your body does adjust to that. And so, for example, one thing that we know from women who are using hormonal birth control is that they're never in a state of high levels of estrogen like you are when you're a naturally cycling woman. Because for a naturally cycling woman, you get this really beautiful, sharp rise in estrogen that precedes ovulation. And so we go through this period of estrogen dominance, but not in the bad way that most of us tend to think of it. It's just this period where this is our dominant hormone. And you never get that as a naturally cycling woman. So one prediction that a person could make, and I think that there's probably some evidence that this is true. There's at least evidence pointing in this direction, is that you would have you'd either have more receptors for estrogen than you would otherwise, just simply because when we have a really low level of a hormone, a lot of times what our brain will do is it'll sprout new connections to
Yeah.
try to pick up and grab as much of that hormone as they possibly can because it feels like it's in a deprived state. And like the reverse of this is like when there's a really high level of a hormone, like for example, with the progestins, we might see the progesterone receptors actually retract and retreat, and that there's fewer of them because you're constantly getting inundated by these hormones. And so one would expect that you would get these kinds of differences. And you'd also might get, less adaptability to hormonal change because, for a naturally cycling woman, you go through these periods where estrogen is climbing and climbing and climbing and becomes really high and then falls. And then it starts to climb up a little bit in the last half of the cycle. The progesterone levels are really low at the beginning of the cycle. And then all of a sudden they climb up and then they fall down. And so for naturally cycling women, it's like our brains have to learn to be very responsive and be able to figure all of that out and be really plastic in response to those things. And so one thing I've always wondered, and there's just not research on this, unfortunately, is whether or not women who are on hormonal birth control for a long period of time, particularly if they go on it during their teenage years when their brains are still developing and developing their sort of permanent structure, whether or not you get less flexibility in these women where they're not as adept at being able to navigate and seamlessly manage these sort of wild hormonal changes that we get in naturally cycling women. And one of the reasons that people sometimes put their teenagers on birth control is because it is a learning process. Like the process of your brain learning how to coordinate that, this wild hormonal ride and being able to listen to those hormones and understand what it's supposed to be doing next. I mean, it's like any process that's involving multiple structures. It requires some time. And that's why a lot of times when women first get their periods, it's not like it's like immediately they have this like beautiful, perfect, textbook 28 or 29-day cycle, and they're always able to predict it. And there's no terrible, symptoms. Instead, their bodies are kind of like, I don't know, I'm trying to figure this out and you're trying to figure this out. And, and it takes women some time. But generally, if we let that time go, their bodies, they do figure it out. And it's just a little bit of a learning curve.
Wow, that is so interesting, especially about the like flexibility and being able to deal with hormones better, the hormonal change better. Because we're talking about like the brain and our body, changing with these hormones or being affected by these hormones or how well they do. Does this have anything to do with though, like with moodiness or the depression or anxiety? Because you hear so often from people like, oh, I couldn't do the birth control pill. It just made me so moody. I know that was my case. Like I was crying over tying my shoes, like it just was so hard for me. And so is this maybe why? Because of all these hormonal changes in the brain? Like why all the moodiness or depression or things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, to start with, there is a really pretty compelling body of research that links usage of hormonal birth control to an increased risk of developing both depression and anxiety. And the reasons behind this, there's so many factors that sort of interact to impact this change in risk factors. One of the big ones is that, and this is the one that's by far had the most research, are changes in levels of this really beautiful neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone is a metabolite. So it's a metabolic byproduct of progesterone. So for a naturally cycling woman, when your body is breaking down progesterone, one of the things that happens when it gets broken into all those pieces is some of those pieces are this neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone stimulates our GABA receptors in our brain. And GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that has the effect of really kind of calming down the brain, making us feel relaxed and making us feel like everything is okay. So just to give you some examples of things that stimulate GABA receptor stimulation, things like doing yoga, sitting by the fireplace, meditating. Alcohol actually stimulates GABA receptors. And that's part of that feeling that people get when they, if you have a glass of wine at the end of the day where you kind of feel like you're chilling out a little bit, that's GABA receptors being stimulated. And so women have their own internal form of that glass of wine in the form of allopregnanolone when progesterone is being released. Because when it gets broken down, it stimulates these receptors. Now, the progestins in hormonal birth control aren't made out of progesterone. Most of them are synthesized out of testosterone, and some of them are synthesized out of spironolactone. But none of them are synthesized out of progesterone. And when they are metabolized, there's no allopregnanolone release because it's a totally different chemical. Scientists have just like monkeyed with the molecular structure of testosterone in a way that will stimulate progesterone receptors in a way that fools the brain into not stimulating the ovaries, but it doesn't have all these other beautiful neuroprotective effects that actual real deal progesterone has. And so that's believed to be one of the big sort of culprits, especially of birth control induced anxiety. But there's also, with birth control induced depression, and you also get changes in our ability to regulate our stress response that you get. Research has found that women who are on hormonal birth control, that they're not able to have the same dynamic responsiveness to stress relative to what is observed in naturally cycling women. And it's believed that constant exposure to stress and not being able to regulate your stress response in a way that's effective ultimately can lead to depression and also problems with anxiety. Like a third thing that's not necessarily working in your favor when it comes to birth control and mood is that you're not getting that beautiful period of time when estrogen is the dominant sex hormone. And that's something that for a lot of women is associated with, feeling really good, just like feeling vibrant and feeling sexy and feeling alive and having a lot of energy and having these dynamic changes in your sort of amplitude of your energy and sexual desire and like how desirable you feel. All of these things are part of what contributes to mental health and, sort of like good, I almost want to call it like psychological tone, right? Just this ability to kind of respond to things and like experience these different, changes and a lot of that I think also contributes to the differences in the levels of well-being that we tend to see in pill takers compared to not.
Well, as you're talking, I'm having this thought of, oh my goodness, there are so many teens these days on birth control for like acne or for, different period issues that they're having. And as you're talking about this, I'm like, well, is this concerning though, that we've got so many teens on it who still have developing brains where this can affect their depression or anxiety? And we're seeing a rise in depression and anxiety. So is it a concern that so many teens are on this? A concern for mental health reasons?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that this is one of the things that we're going to look back on this in 50 years and everybody's going to do a collective face palm. Like, why did we do this? So, as a lot of folks know, but maybe not everybody knows, your brain is still developing until you're in your 20s. And like most of the heavy lifting is usually done by the time you're 19 or 20. And then after that, there's still some work that's being done, especially on our frontal lobes and like the frontal cortex. But a lot of things happen to the brain during the pubertal transition, like the whole process. The brain completely remodels itself when you go through puberty. It goes from being that like cute little, I like bubbles and kittens in the park, sort of version of humans that kids are, human children, into this really complex, really emotionally complex, psychologically complex adult. That whole transition is coordinated by sex hormones. The pubertal transition is all about, these sex hormones having this effect of reorganizing the brain into its adult version of itself. And so to go into that process and to be giving girls hormonal birth control, which is shutting down their own hormone production because it's preventing ovulation. And that's how women make hormones, right? That release of estrogen and then progesterone after you ovulate. So it's shutting down women's own production of sex hormones and then replacing them with this same dose of these synthetics every day. And given that sex hormones are so important in the pubertal transition and pubertal brain development, there's no way that it doesn't affect brain development. I mean, it's just, a magic show if somebody found that was true. And but nobody was really studying this. So nobody's really asked the question. There's only been a handful of studies that have been published in the last, however many years the pill's been available now, like 60 years. There's only been a handful of studies that have looked at this really important question, and that is, hey, what happens when we put teenage girls on birth control? Like, does that cause long-term structural change? And we don't yet know the answer to that. But what we do know is that there is research now, and it's kind of all pointing in the same direction. And it seems to suggest that if you go on hormonal birth control when you're a teen and your brain is still developing, that this can put you on the road for an increased risk of developing major depressive disorder across your lifetime, even after you go off of it. And for some women and their mothers, or some girls and their moms, if they have a conversation with their doctor and they're given this information, they might not make that same choice. That like each of us as a patient or as a parent, it's like most of us don't have a degree in, neurodevelopmental psychology. And so we rely on our doctors to give us information about, what the effects of this might be. And it's just not something that any of them are trained in. And I think that it's a blind spot, because it's like all doctors understand how brain development works, and they understand the timeline of brain development. And ultimately they have to know that sex hormones play an organizational role in the brain development. But because we're giving women a drug for cramps or whatever it is, or acne, it's like they're just not even thinking about it. They're only thinking about it in terms of the symptom instead of thinking about what it does to the whole person. And, I think that with teens, it's all about having that information, because some girls and their mothers, especially if the pill is being used for pregnancy prevention, they might say, okay, I understand the trade-offs. It still makes sense because avoiding pregnancy is so important. But for things like acne and cramps, for example, I think that most women and most girls even would say, like, do I want an increased risk of depression throughout my entire lifespan just because I don't want to, like, I'm not washing my face enough? Like, wouldn't that be like, should we try something else first? And instead of having this be the first line of defense, because the idea that the first line of defense for something as sort of superficial, and I don't mean this, that it's because it really is hard for people who struggle with, having skin problems and that sort of thing. But the magnitude of the potential life, altering effects that this can have on girls, um, is just too big to be ignored, in the context of making, recommendations for things like clearing up your skin.
Yeah, so it sounds like to me that it purely comes down to knowing the side effects so that we can make the correct decision for our child or for ourselves. And I saw this Facebook group post the other day, and it was talking about a mother wanted to put her daughter on birth control for her skin. And she was like, do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it will cause moodiness? And what was sad to me was the comments were like, oh yeah, it causes moodiness, but I asked my doctor and he didn't know why. Or I talked to my doctor about this and they just weren't sure why it causes the moodiness. And some other one was like, yeah, I felt really depressed and my doctor wasn't quite sure. And I'm like, why aren't the doctors quite sure if it's sort of basic science as
Right.
to the side effects of birth control?
Right. It's really interesting because medicine as a practice kind of started before people really understood that, that the brain is a body part, right? There used to be that Cartesian split where it was like there was the mind and then the body, right? And so the sort of psychological impact of different types of drugs that were on is never something that was really even taken into consideration, because it was like the self was seen as not being a biological process and sort of immune to those kinds of forces. But now that we know better, it's like we really need to to change
Yeah.
medicine in a way where the psychological side effects are like seen, because normally when they test drugs, what they're looking at are two things. They're looking at safety, right? So is this going to kill you? And then efficacy, does it work? And then beyond that, and then it's just like everything else gets pushed into a file cabinet called side effects, which are just the things that people report, that are happening that they like didn't want to happen. And the mental health stuff is just sort of thrown into that filing cabinet of side effects, when, it's like the brain is a body part. And part of what we should be doing when we're studying drugs or any sort of intervention, it should be psychological effects. So, it's like safety, psychological effects, effectiveness,
Right.
because our brain is a body part, and anything that we put into our body is also going to affect our brain. And that's going to change how we feel about ourselves, potentially, like how we experience the world, and all sorts of important things like that.
Yeah, let's hope that the pendulum someday soon swings that way so that they include the psychological effects as well, because obviously there is science as to why it can contribute to depression or anxiety, things like that. Let's take a quick break to hear from our show sponsor. Switching to a more toxin-free lifestyle is a challenge, and some swaps are harder than others. One of the swaps that has been hard for me is finding a laundry detergent that cleans my clothes and leaves them smelling good. Thanks to my loyal listeners and followers, I learned about Truly Free. Truly Free creates both laundry and home cleaning products for families who want family-safe, non-toxic cleaning solutions that actually work. Truly Free is free from chlorine bleach, phosphates, 4-dioxane, and harmful fragrances. I am getting the results I want without any of the dangerous chemicals. Truly Free offers refillable and reusable packaging, which empowers families to reduce their environmental footprint. Get real cleaning power with absolutely zero scary ingredients. Use code JUSTINGREDIENTS at trulyfreehome.com today. Now back to the show. Talking about depression and anxiety, I'm curious, does it though have anything to do with postpartum at all? Have we researched any of that?
Right. No, that's a really great question. And it's not one that we really have a good answer to. So postpartum, a few things that I do know, and then I'll speak to the pill. But people who suffer from postpartum depression oftentimes are people who are sensitive to hormonal changes of all sort. So if you're somebody, for example, who gets bad PMS, or you have PMDD, for example, chances are you're going to end up with postpartum depression. And chances are you're probably going to have a rough menopausal transition as well, because some people, when they're really sensitive to those changes, that's kind of the way that it goes. Now, one really interesting question is, does going on the pill in the way that we talked about make us less flexible, less hormonally flexible, because we're not used to having to go through these periods of dynamic hormone changes that naturally cycling women are? And does that lack of flexibility then increase a person's risk of developing postpartum depression and experiencing changes? For example, having a more rough perimenopausal transition. We don't have research on that, but I'd be willing to bet that it does, because it would seem surprising to me that it doesn't. And there's also some research that shows that women who are on hormonal birth control can experience differences in oxytocin signaling. And oxytocin is something that plays a really important role in terms of the development of the bond between the mom and the baby. And it seems to me that, when women are given their postpartum appointments, one of the first questions that their doctors ask them is, what are you going to do for birth control? Right. And for good reason, right? It's like most doctors are people who really do care about their patients, even if they don't always go about it in the way that I would necessarily think is the best. But so they want to get women on something to regulate their fertility, and a lot of times they put them on birth control pills, like hormonal birth control. And if we're putting somebody on hormonal birth control and it can disrupt oxytocin signaling, which it's a very small number of studies, but the research that has been done on the topic finds that dysregulation, what it was called dysregulation, both of the studies, and like I said, this has not been well studied, have found some evidence of that. And if this is true, this also could potentially be something that creates interference with the normal mechanisms that create that usual bonding experience between mom and child. So there's sort of the potential for the pill to impact that attachment and those feelings along multiple sort of pathways.
That is really interesting. But if it interferes with the oxytocin connections, that also could play a role in people's depression or moodiness or, anxiety, those things as well.
Right. No, I mean, absolutely. It's like when you look at all of the different mechanisms or the different pathways in the brain and throughout the rest of the body that are touched by birth control pill use, it's like it changes so many things at the same time it's impossible not to have some sort of fallout within the body, where you get something that's not doesn't quite feel the way that it used to feel before, even if it's not something that women notice until after the fact. It's funny because you get these changes, and some women will be on hormonal birth control and they have no problems with anxiety and depression, right? Then you'll have some women who are on it and they're like, oh my gosh, it made me crazy. Like it was horrible. I cried all the time. And it's flipped so many switches in the body, and the way that each one of us responds to all of that switch flipping is pretty idiosyncratic. And this is why, so many of us have so many different experiences on the pill. And so, because no two of us metabolize hormones the same way. No two of us has the exact same number of hormone receptors, like receptors for estrogen and receptors for testosterone and receptors for progesterone. And none of us, all of us have different pre-existing hormone levels that we go into before we start taking the pill. And so when any of us take something that flips all of these switches, for some of us, that's going to be a really minor change within the body. And then for other people, it's going to be a huge change within the body. And so, the really important thing, and the thing I go back to over and over again in my book, is just this idea of not that, don't ever go on the pill, or the pill is terrible and evil and awful. Instead, it's like, hey, we don't have a lot of options for regulating our fertility. A lot of women will choose to be on the pill at some points in their lives. Here's what we know from research about what this can do. And here's what we know, like it does in the brain. Here are the things that we know that it can affect in terms of people's experiences in the world. And use this information then to make the decisions about whether or not those are trade-offs that you want to make in your life. And because for each one of us, it's like our willingness to make those trade-offs is going to change depending on where we are in our lives.
Right.
As a young college student who wasn't particularly good at doing things like, keeping track of my cycle and that sort of thing, using, for example, the fertility awareness method would have been an absolute disaster for me, because I was trying to get my degree, and if I had an accidental pregnancy, it would be disastrous. And I was not good at keeping track of anything, except for like when my next exam was going to be. And so,
Yeah.
all of us are smart enough to make whatever decision is right for ourselves. And so I think that the best that we can do is just really try to offer people the most straightforward information about the way that things work possible. And then, hopefully people will be able to use that in a way that allows them to make them, improve the quality of their own life.
Yeah, I love that advice, because honestly, it just comes down to being educated so that you can make the best choice for you, your child, whoever it is. And so we just need to know that these are side effects, because like I said, so many people don't know. And I wish I would have known, because I battled depression years ago. And so I wish I had known the side effects were, hey, maybe it can contribute a little bit, to the depression or the anxiety or feeling stressed out, things like that. And so it's good that we're at least having these conversations so women can hopefully hear this and learn it and know it and make their own choices, like you said. So it's just something that needs to get out there more, because we don't talk about all of the side effects. Social media makes it like, oh, it's terrible, it's bad, or it's fine. And no one's in the middle just saying, hey, let's just talk about the side effects so that you can make your own informed decision.
Yeah, no, it's funny because you're totally right about that. On social media, it's like either like, oh my gosh, the birth control pill is going to make you grow a tail, And it's like, oh my gosh, no, I don't want a tail. And so it's sort of like scaring women that way. And then you have on the other side, you have people saying like, no, the pill is perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. Like, why, I just read a statement by I forget exactly what it's called, but it's the regulating agency for OB-GYNs. So it's the ACOG or whatever. I forget. I don't even remember what it's called. But I just read their statement about birth control and about how, there's many women, an increasing number of women are talking about concerns with birth control. But all of these are based on exaggerations of side effects. And it was just this really condescending thing where many women have a fine time on the birth control pill and they have no problems at all. But there are a lot of women who really struggle on it and they have a very terrible time on it. And their experiences are real. And just because they don't happen all the time doesn't mean that they're not real. And it doesn't mean that they're being imagined. And so, it always seems like the party line is either like, the birth control pill is the best. And just, people are blowing up these blown up accounts of side effects and none of it's true. And just shut up and take your pill. And then there's, the birth control pill is going to, make you infertile and, some of these other things that there's just really not evidence of. So, having a conversation, a thoughtful conversation about like, no, this isn't perfect. And here's all the different things here's the trade-offs that you're making, and then use that information in a way that's going to be useful to you. And also just to know that your journey isn't going to be the same as everybody else's, and that
Right.
each one of us, something that can be right for me isn't necessarily what's going to be the right for the other person down the road.
Right. I so agree. Okay, I'm going to ask you more questions and we're going to leave like the mental health, move on to a couple other things. You always hear about the weight gain or your physical appearance. So does the pill really affect your physical appearance, your weight gain, things like that?
So the weight gain thing is really interesting because I just wrote about this in a research paper. We'll start by talking about that. And the party line in science is that birth control, no, does not affect weight gain, right? It's like, well, okay, unless it is the birth control shot. So that's the one where everybody's willing to concede the fact that, yes, women do seem to be gaining weight at a disproportionate rate when they're put on the birth control shot relative to other forms of hormonal birth control. But if you look at the research and you look at it a little bit more closely, the answer is a lot more complicated than yes or no.
Mm.
And for example, in one study, and I break this down in this recent research paper of mine, where we looked at the data that was presented showing, it was a study done where they randomly assigned women to take this type of birth control or not. And then they measured their weight gain over time. And what they found was there was no differences in weight gain. But then if you break down their results in terms of what women's BMI was, so how heavy the women were when they started the study, and you look at their weight change over time, what you actually get is you do get differences. It just differs depending on whether you started with a low or high body weight. And so for women who were in the study who had high body weight and they went on the birth control pill, they lost weight. And then
Oh,
for women who had low body weight, when they went on birth control, they gained weight. And so essentially, when you put all of those women together in a single sample, it looks like you have no change in weight gain, right? Because some women are gaining
interesting.
weight and some women are losing weight. And undoubtedly, because of the way that hormones work, you're going to find this type of interactive effect on almost anything that's worth measuring. So, for example, sexual desire, I'm guessing that women who have really high sexual desire, you put them on the pill, they probably have decreased sexual desire. You have women with sort of middling sexual desire or low sexual desire, they might have increased I mean, there's a fairly substantial body of evidence showing the sexual desire effect now that women on hormonal birth control can have lower libido. But with a lot of these effects where they're like, oh well, there's really no evidence of this. It's like, is there really no evidence of this, or are we just not studying this right? Because a lot of the studies, the way that they make the comparisons is between women who are using birth control and not, and they're not doing it in a more nuanced way where it's asking questions, for example, like the weight gain question of like, well, what was your weight starting out with, right? And then how does the pill then interact with that sort of person-based variable then to impact the outcomes? And so, yes, it may impact weight gain, but it may impact weight loss. It just kind of depends on where you're at. The other things that the pill can do to physical appearance, and it's like less of a overt physical appearance thing, but it does have to do with like sort of the physicality of yourself, is when you're on hormonal birth control, you don't experience that nice, beautiful rise in estrogen that we get as naturally cycling women. And estrogen is something that is known like to promote all things female sexual attractiveness. So it does things like makes our skin more vibrant. It makes our gait sexier. It makes our voices sexier. We smell sexier. And so when women are, naturally cycling and they're going through what we call either the fertile window or the periovulatory window, which is that period in the cycle about 5 or so days prior to ovulation, up to ovulation, when estrogen is rising and rising and rising, most women kind of feel their best, they look their best, and they report really feeling a lot sexier than they do at other points in the cycle. And so when you blunt that and you're, suppressing women's own hormone production, and then you're giving them the same daily dose of this, progestin dominant pill, they never get to experience that. That gets suppressed. And so a lot of women have had the experience, and I've spoken to women, and this was very much true of me as well, was, I was on the pill and then I went off of it. And then all of a sudden I was very in touch with all things sexiness. It was just like all of a sudden, it was just like I was a lot. I felt, like my first ovulatory cycle, I felt like a tigress. It was just like I just felt like this really sexy, person, and I just felt really good about myself. And I got to re-experience what that feels like after having that suppressed for so long, again, minus my very short period of time I spent as a cycling woman before getting pregnant with both my kids. But yeah, it was really it can be very it can be really good for the way that women feel about themselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so if they never experience that raise in estrogen, to feel sexy and, like you said, like a tigress, does this affect people's attraction to, like, their partner, or you know what I mean? Like, does
Right.
this
Yeah.
cause an
Yeah.
issue?
Yeah. So, there's been research done where it shows that women who choose their partners when they're using hormonal birth control, the research seems to suggest that women may be less attuned to all things sex, sexiness, and sexual desire when it comes to choosing their partners when they're on the pill. So there was one study, for example, where they studied a couple of thousand women, and they asked them about whether or not they chose their partner when they were on or off the pill. And then they asked them about various types of satisfaction in their relationship. So how satisfied are you with your sexual attraction to your partner? How satisfied are you with your sex life, your sexual adventurousness, et cetera, et cetera. And then it was also things like your partner's intelligence, your partner's earning capacity, and et cetera, et cetera. And what they found is that women who chose their partners when they were naturally cycling, they were more satisfied with all of the sexy related things on the map. It was like sexual attraction to their partner, the quality of the sex that they're having, their the quantity of the sex that they're having. They just felt more attraction to their partner, and they felt better about the sex that they were having with their partner. Where women who chose their partners when they were on the pill, they were more satisfied with things like earning capacity and like the intelligence of their partner. So it almost seems like it kind of nudges you to prioritize different types of things. And when you're, a naturally cycling woman, when you're a naturally cycling woman and you go through these periods where, you're really in tune with things like sexual desire and sexiness and that sort of thing, that sort of becomes one of the things, one of the many things that women prioritize when they're choosing a partner. And that for women who are not on hormonal, or for women who are on hormonal birth control and aren't having those changes, that instead it's just very much focused on some of the other types of qualities that women tend to value. So things like partner's earning capacity and that sort of thing, sort of like flipping a light switch off on all of the sort of sexy related variables in terms of partner choice.
Wow, that is really interesting. Okay, so I know you touched upon this really quickly, but so people's libido then on and off the pill, it sounds like then it would be decreased, but you mentioned that maybe it's increased for some, but it sounds like you flipped that switch off with the sexiness switch that you flipped off. So
Right. Yeah. So what research tends to find is that, being on hormonal birth control can be associated with a decreased risk in sexual desire and sexual functioning. And that many women experience a libido, decrease in response to the pill. And the reasons for this are exactly what you would expect. And, when you don't have that beautiful rise in estrogen where you go through that sexual tigress, state, that this is going to be something that isn't particularly good for sexual desire, because research, tons of research finds that estrogen levels are in fact a good predictor of women's levels of sexual desire. And another thing that happens on the pill is that your body starts releasing more of what's known as sex hormone binding globulin. And these little binding globulins actually grab onto testosterone and make it inactive. And so women who are using hormonal birth control usually have about 60% lower levels of free testosterone than naturally cycling women. And testosterone is something that's also important in women's sexual desire and sexual functioning. And so you combine that with the, estrogen being kept low kind of across the cycle, and you kind of have the perfect recipe for a lower libido.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's one of these things where, there seem to be individual differences, right? The majority of research finds a sexual desire effect, but not 100% of research. Some research finds there's no differences between women who are using or not using hormonal birth control. And in those cases, my guess is, again, is that you're going to have sort of a idiosyncrasy in results where some women are going to have a total crash in their libido where they feel no sexual desire. You have some women who may have increased sexual desire because not having to worry about pregnancy, for example, is something that can be very sexually freeing, right? And make you feel like a lot more comfortable with sex because you're not worrying about getting pregnant. Or it could be have to do with how attracted you are to your partner. And like if you're really attracted to your partner, it does this to your sexual desire. If you're not really attracted to your partner, it does that to your sexual desire. And hormones are just they touch everything in our body. It's like they affect the way that our brain does business. They affect the way our immune system does business. They affect the way that our respiratory system does business, our cardiovascular system does business. It touches everything. It like flips all these little switches all over the place. And the way that all of that sort of lands on each one of us is going to be a little bit different. And, and hormones just kind of nudge us in different directions. Like, it can kind of nudge us in and out of a state of high sexual desire, and nudge us in and out of a state of, low mood. It's amazing to me that it took us so long to like put two and two together and really start to think about, okay, given all the different things that hormones touch in the female body, because our bodies are wired to be sensitive to sex hormones because they have to be because of pregnancy. And pregnancy requires the body to do a complete workaround in everything that it's doing, whether it's our metabolism to our sleep and everything else. And so our bodies are wired to be very sensitive to sex hormones. And that it took us so long to consider the fact that if we take hormonal birth control, that it's going to change all of these different systems that are sensitive to sex hormones. And that's going to have some pretty profound effects on the way that women think and feel and experience the world. Is really, shocking to me. But I'm glad that we're finally starting these conversations.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, hormones affect so many parts of the body. And so when you were saying, oh, it can decrease testosterone and it lowers that estrogen, I started thinking to myself, well, this could cause a lot of other effects though, because I know like your heart really needs the estrogen, your muscles really need the testosterone, like your immune system, like you said. So are we affecting other parts of the body as well, possibly with physical health that we're not paying attention to?
Oh, yes, 100%, absolutely. I mean, so one of the things that really kind of gave me my light bulb moment where I was like, oh my gosh, of course the pill affects everything because it affects everything, was I was at a talk where they were talking about the fact that women who are using hormonal birth control don't experience a cortisol response to stress like every other healthy, functioning human being does. And it was just like, why does a pill affect your stress response? And it's like, of course it affects the stress response. It affects friggin' everything. And so, yes, absolutely. I have no doubt in my mind that we have just barely scratched the surface in terms of the way that this affects the body from head to toe. And we just, my research lab and we just published a paper that came out this year where we did a study looking at women's inflammatory response to stress and how that differs depending on whether you're on hormonal birth control or not. And so what we did is we had women, naturally cycling women who were in the luteal phase of the cycle. So kind of trying to hormonally match what hormonal birth control pill users are like, because they're in that sort of progestin dominant state. And we had a sample of birth control pill users. And we had them come into the lab and we stressed them out by having to give a public speech, and then have to count backwards from like 100, or no, it was like 1,322 in steps of 13. And they had to do that. And if they messed up, they had to restart. And so it's like this really stressful paradigm. It's called the Trier Social Stress Test. And so we stressed everybody out. And then we measured their inflammatory response to stress because our immune system, in addition to responding to germs and vaccinations and other things that immune systems respond to, they also respond to stress. And when we get stressed out, our immune system starts releasing inflammatory factors because it's preparing for the possibility that we might have to fight or get injured. And so we were really interested in that specifically because there's been research linking hormonal birth control use with autoimmune disease. And so we were really interested in like whether you get an exaggerated inflammatory response among women who are using hormonal birth control, which is something that we might expect given that they don't tend to release cortisol in response to stress, because cortisol helps to regulate inflammation. And so we did this study, and what we find is that lo and behold, women who are using hormonal birth control, that they do have a very different inflammatory response to stress. And in particular, their inflammatory response to stress tends to be characterized by an exaggerated release of one particular type of cytokine called TNF alpha, which is one that is very well known to be implicated in various forms of autoimmune disease. And so, and why do they respond that way? We have no idea, but it's just that hormones affect everything, and they flip all these switches. And this is going to be true for everything ranging from our cardiovascular system, because our cardiovascular system is sensitive to sex hormones because pregnancy requires a total workaround there. Our immune systems are sensitive to sex hormones for the exact same reason. Our digestive system and our metabolism, that's all affected by our sex. I mean, all of these things. And when you change a woman's profile of sex hormones, that's going to have these sort of echoing effects throughout the body from head to toe. And we're just starting to, people are just starting to ask those questions about what does this actually do?
That is fascinating because inflammation is like the root cause of so many health issues out there today. And so I'm listening to all of this thinking like, we have so many women dealing with stress, so many dealing with depression, anxiety, not being able to deal with all the pressures of life. But then we've got so many women with autoimmune issues and so many with inflammation. And I'm like, could we maybe take a step back and realize that so many women are on birth control? Could this be one of the many facets of why we're dealing with all of this?
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and you'd asked this similar version of this question when we were talking about teen mental health. And, we're in the midst of a crisis with teen mental health right now, and especially with girls. And I have no doubt in my mind that this isn't a contributor. Like, is it the only contributor? No, there's
No,
lots of
yeah.
contributors, right? But I would be absolutely shocked if it wasn't an important contributor.
Right.
And same with, when we look at things like autoimmune disease,
those are on the rise.
yeah, they are on the rise. And it's like, gee, I wonder why that is. And we've been monkeying with women's sex hormones. And I can't help but think that those things are connected.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, there's one other thing I want to ask you because I hear about this a lot on social media. Different people talking about vitamin and mineral deficiencies on the birth control pill. So is that true? Does it really make you deficient or lacking in some of these nutrients?
It can. So there is some research that suggests that hormonal birth control can cause certain nutritional deficits that can come into play when you're on it. And because I'm a psychologist and not a physician, I don't know what they are off the top of my head. But I've done enough research into that to know that there's a couple of vitamins. But I mean, truthfully, it's something where if you are aware of it, you could probably take a supplement and be just fine. But it does seem to deplete some important nutrients. And so yeah, I would recommend either Dr. Jolene Brighton's book or Dr. Laura Brydon's book. They talk about this, and because they're both in the sort of physical health space, have a lot more information about this than I do. But I do know from because I had the same question you did when I was first hearing about that. I'm like, I don't know about that. And so I went into the research literature and I found that sure enough, there are some differences, but I just don't know exactly what they are.
Okay. Also, this is the $1 million question. And I know every listener who's listening to this podcast is like, well, okay, what are my other options then if I don't want to do the birth control pill for birth control? What should I do? Do you have suggestions you like, or what's your advice on that?
Right. So the first thing I would say to that is if you are somebody who's using hormonal birth control and you feel good, and you don't and you are aware of what the trade-offs are and you're happy, there's no reason to go off of it. It is something that you can be on safely for a number of years, and there's no real evidence that seems to suggest that that there's big problems with that. And so if you feel better on it than off of it, or you are fine with it, you don't need to go off it. if you do want to go off of it because you're interested, you're sort of natural cycle, like curious, and you want to experience your natural sort of hormonal fluctuations, one possibility is the copper IUD. So this is a non-hormonal IUD, and it's not necessarily a lot of fun to have put in. A lot of women feel pretty uncomfortable when it's being inserted. And it can lead to heavier cramping and heavier cycles, especially for the first little while that you're on it. So, I mean, it can take about a year for your body to really adjust. That is an option. And it sounds so barbaric. I mean, this is like where we're at, it's like, it's this kind of barbaric answer, but a lot of women really love it. And I mean, if I didn't have a vasectomized partner, this is what I would be using, because it is what it is. I've had an IUD put in before. It's not a lot of fun. But it's ultimately like, not, you don't have to think about it. It's not hormonal. You still ovulate, you still have your cycles, and you feel pretty much like yourself. For most women feel like themselves when they're on it. There's also the fertility awareness method. I use this even though I don't need to, because I, like I said, I've got a vasectomized partner. Thankfully, he's okay that I talk about it on podcasts all the time. And this is just where you're keeping track of where you are in your cycle, and using your body temperature and your cervical mucus as a means of assessing cycle phase. And if you're really conscientious and on top of this sort of thing, where you are, good at logging your symptoms across the cycle, and you're also good, because this is why I wouldn't use this, I would use the IUD. You're also good at not having sex during the fertile window, or you're willing to have sex with a condom or some other sort of backup mode of contraception, then which requires a lot of discipline, because women experience highest sexual desire right when they're in their fertile window. Evolution would have it no other way. And so what happens a lot of times with women is, it's like, it's all well and good, and then they're in this moment where they're highly fertile and they just really want to have sex, and then they're like, oh my gosh, okay, well, I guess we have to go find condoms. And sometimes that can end up in a disastrous scenario, from what I've heard. So, it's like you have to sort of know what you're getting into with that. But a lot of women really love it. And I mean, honestly, I recommend fertility awareness, and not even necessarily as birth control, but just to really understand yourself and your body's relationship to hormones, because you really can get so much insight, because there's so many changes that occur in our bodies at sort of a small level. But when you begin to see them over time, it's like you really get in touch with who you are and how you respond to things. And it's something that can really get you in touch. Like it helps to kind of bring you back to earth, where you're like, okay, I know I'm feeling this way. Like my partner is not a complete jerk. It's I am feeling really sensitive right now for this reason, or I get in the luteal phase, I get allergic asthma. My symptoms are more severe, which is very common. And that can feel really alarming, if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't breathe. And like, why is this happening right now? And like all this, and it's like, oh no, this is progesterone, and it does that sometimes. And it's really useful that way. So I kind of went off the rails there, but fertility awareness is another way of doing it. There's also, of course, the condom is, nobody really loves it, but it's great at protecting from pregnancy and also sexually transmitted infections. There's the diaphragm, which still exists. Like, nobody talks about it. And so it seems like it's like off the map, but it exists. It just requires a little bit of preparation, because you've got to pop it in before you have sex, and you got to put spermicide in it. And it's not as effective as a birth control pill, but it is still pretty good. And so those are some of the other options. And like I said, and there's gels like Phexxi, right, which is the vaginal gel that it's again, the effectiveness isn't as high as the pill, but it's it's a reasonable option for women as part of their birth control regimen.
Yeah, there's no easy option, is what I always say. There's pros and cons, and hard and easy risks, with everything. So
yeah,
it's what they come down to. And I know we need to wrap up due to time, but I know my listeners are going to want one other question, because I forgot to ask you, but it's also a big question. So maybe we'll just give the simplified version, and they can come follow you on Instagram for more advice and read your book, because your book is amazing. Your Instagram's amazing. But I know this is a big one going around on social media, saying yes or no to whether the birth control pill affects fertility?
Okay, yeah. So the short answer is no, it does not affect fertility. The long answer is, well, maybe indirectly. So, a lot of times what happens, birth control pills, because they allow you to postpone pregnancy for so long, a lot of women will just keep postponing pregnancy. And then they get off of it and they're 30 years old and they're not getting pregnant. They're like, oh my gosh, like the pill made me infertile. When the fact is, female fertility, it's like one of the cruelest facts of nature, but it peaks at about 25. And so your fertility is at its apex at that point, and then it just starts to decline from there. And, for some women, it declines more rapidly. For others women, it declines more slowly. And so, indirectly, the pill can be linked to infertility just simply because it allows women to continue to postpone childbearing until a time when it's a lot more challenging. And the pill can also mask reproductive problems that women didn't know that they had, because, you take the pill and then you have the withdrawal bleed, and then you take the pill and you have the withdrawal bleed. You don't really know whether or not you have any reproductive health problems, because the pill is like a nice Band-Aid and prevents their symptoms. And so a woman potentially could go off of it and discover that she has really bad endometriosis, for example. And then that can be something that has to be taken care of before pregnancy is going to most likely be able to be successful. And so that can create problems that way. But, all of the research, when they look at what is the length of time it takes you to get pregnant for women who've been on the pill for a long time and for women who aren't, there's a little bit of a lag time for women who are on hormonal birth control, but it's only by about a month.
Okay, so good to know. And I know listeners were like, ask that question. So thank you so much for being here. I have literally 1 million more questions I could ask you, because the pill is so intriguing and there's so many different side effects and things. But I love that you are out there trying to teach others about this and just informing people about their side effects and risks, like you said, so that they can make their own informed choice. And I just absolutely love that and love what you're doing. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank
you. I always end my podcast episodes by asking my guests what they have found to be the best ingredient in life. What would you say it is?
It's love. It's relationships.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's perfect for what you do and all that you teach.
Yeah, no, totally. It's like relationships and health. And then, everything else kind of by the side.
Oh, I love that. Well, listeners, like I said, go give her a follow. You will learn so much. You will find it so intriguing and fascinating. And we should tell people where they can find you, though, because I follow you on Instagram, but tell them where else they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at Sarah E. Hill PhD, and that's my my handle on all platforms. So you can find me everywhere. I'm most active on Instagram. And you can find my website, which is just sarahehill.com. And my book is available everywhere the books are sold.
I have to tell you something about your book. One of the people on my podcast team said, her book is so good, it should be required reading for every woman out there. And I was like, oh, it should be. It is good stuff.
Thank you so much. That's so kind.
Thank you for writing that book. And again, thank you so much for being here. It was so nice talking to you.
It was so great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Remember to subscribe to the Just Ingredients podcast to learn more about your health and good ingredients to life. Plus, get daily tips at just.ingredients on Instagram.